There was a time when Foden thought they'd cracked it. A bold new diesel engine, simpler, lighter, faster revving, designed and built entirely in-house to take on the giants. Cummins, Gardner, even Detroit Diesel. It wasn't a copy, it wasn't outsourced, it was theirs. The Foden FD series, a two-stroke diesel that looked like the future, until it all came crashing down. Because this is the story of how a legendary lorry maker gambled everything on a noisy, smoky, high-strung engine and paid the price. Let's rewind to post-war Britain, the 1950s. Foden was on a roll. Their trucks were tough, trusted, and built like tanks. Hauliers loved them. They'd run through mud, coal pits, construction sites, you name it. And under the cab? A Gardner engine, usually. Smooth, efficient, reliable. But there was a problem. Gardner engines weren't easy to get, the waiting list was long, and Foden was tired of building someone else's vision under their own badge. So they did something brave. They decided to make their own engine. But not just another four-stroke. That would have been too safe, too expected. Instead, they went with something radical. A two-stroke diesel. Now, most truck builders wouldn't even consider that. But Foden believed this engine could be the start of something big. They thought it could rev higher, make more power per cubic inch, and weigh less than the big, slow revving rivals. It had fewer moving parts. And it wasn't just theory. This kind of setup was already used in ships, trains, and heavy machinery. Why not trucks? The Foden FD engine hit the market in 1956, first as a 4-cylinder, then 6, and finally as an 8-cylinder beast. The whole design was built around a Roots-type supercharger, because 2-strokes don't breathe naturally like 4-strokes. This thing needed forced induction just to idle. The result? An engine that whined, barked, and shrieked instead of rumbling. A totally different sound from what UK truckers were used to. If a Gardner purred, the Foden 2-stroke howled. On paper, it looked promising. The FD engine had no valves, just ports. The combustion cycle happened every revolution instead of every other. That meant more power, less bulk, and fewer moving bits to brake. It also meant it ran hot, fast, and with a very specific appetite for revs. Perfect if you were hauling straight and fast. But in Britain, on winding roads, up and down hills, constantly shifting gears and dealing with stop-start traffic, the flaws started showing quick. First, the noise. These things didn't just growl like a Cummins or hum like a Gardner. They screamed, loud enough to rattle the fillings in your teeth. Drivers would wear earplugs or just deal with ringing ears after every shift. Then there was the torque curve, or lack of one. The FD engine didn't like to be lugged low. You had to rev it up and keep it there, or it'd bog down and cough like it had pneumonia. And let's talk about smoke. Foden's 2-stroke diesel was a rolling fog machine. If you didn't keep it tuned perfectly, it'd paint the countryside black with unburnt fuel. Cold starts in winter were legendary for all the wrong reasons. You'd crank it for ages, curse under your breath, and if it finally lit off, it'd shake the ground and belch smoke like a volcano. Mechanics? They didn't love it either. The engine was compact, sure, but it was also unfamiliar. 2-strokes have a totally different logic from the typical 4-stroke diesels they were used to. The port timing, blower assembly, and lubrication quirks made servicing awkward. It wasn't that they couldn't fix it, it's that they didn't want to. Still, Foden kept the faith. They rolled out updates, minor tweaks to airflow and cooling, and tried to teach hauliers how to drive them right. They even claimed better fuel efficiency on long motorway hauls, if you kept your foot in it and didn't mind the shriek. But the market wasn't listening. British hauliers weren't asking for high-strung screamers. They wanted torque, reliability, quiet cabs, and trucks that didn't scare away wildlife when they drove by. By the late 60s, emissions laws were getting stricter, complaints about noise were turning into actual regulations, and Foden, seeing the writing on the wall, began to backpedal. Slowly, quietly, they started offering Gardner and Cummins engines again as standard. The FD engine was still there on the order sheet, but barely anyone ticked that box. The 2-stroke dream was fading. And eventually the FD engine disappeared. Not with a bang, but a whisper. No big send-off, no dramatic obituary, just gone. Production quietly ceased. Manuals disappeared, spares dried up. The few that were still running either got engine swaps or were shoved into sheds and forgotten. And to this day, some mechanics still say, half joking, "I'd rather pull out a gearbox in the snow than work on one of those screamers again." If you've ever stood next to a working Foden FD at idle, you don't forget it. That piercing mechanical whine, the rhythmic diesel clatter underneath, and the smell of half-burnt fuel mixing with grease and damp British air. It's like hearing a banshee scream through a wrench factory. Loud? Absolutely. Refined? Not a chance. But alive? Oh, 100%. And despite everything, the smoke, the breakdowns, the bad rep, there's still a few out there refusing to die. Most ended up on farms, the kind of places where reliability means less than familiarity. One farmer kept an old S20 with a 6-pot FD engine parked under a lean-to, started it once a week, and claimed, "It's never let me down," which is probably a lie, but the thing still ran. Others were converted into recovery trucks, yard tractors, or left idle until some truck nerd from the next village over asked if he could take it home and fix it up. That's how these engines survived. Not through engineering brilliance, but through pure stubbornness. And let's be real, some people kept them going because they were weird, because everyone else said they were junk. It became a badge of honor to show up to a vintage rally with a working 2-stroke Foden. You could hear it before you saw it. That high-pitched scream cutting through the rumble of Gardner 1800s and Leyland 401s like a chainsaw at a choir recital. Kids would run toward it. Old drivers would smirk and shake their heads. And somewhere behind the cab, someone would be fiddling with the fuel screw just to keep the thing alive for another round. But here's where it gets kind of poetic. The Foden FD, for all its faults, actually taught the company something. It reminded them that innovation isn't always about being radical. Sometimes it's about listening to the people who actually drive the machines. Foden went back to what worked: strong chassis, solid cabs, reliable engines from proven names. And that return to form kept them alive well into the 90s, long after other British truck makers folded. Meanwhile, the FD engine faded into something else. A legend. Not a glorious one, not a best-in-class trophy winner, but a mechanical ghost that haunted service bays and vintage shows. Some people hated it, some secretly loved it, everyone remembered it, and in the trucking world, being remembered is half the battle. There's also something oddly respectable about Foden even trying it. Think about it. Most truck manufacturers, especially back then, stuck to what they knew. Engines from Gardner, Leyland, Cummins, safe bets, proven tech. Foden said, screw it, let's build our own. Let's make a 2-stroke diesel for the British roads. No one else was even thinking about that. In a weird way, it's the kind of move that makes you root for them, even when it went sideways. Today, you might find one on YouTube, someone filming a cold start in a frosty field, puffing out blue smoke, sounding like an old jet engine and rattling the camera mic. Or maybe in the back of a dusty warehouse, covered in spider webs and spare parts, waiting for someone mad enough to bring it back to life. There's no market for them, no collector's boom, no reproduction parts catalogs or resto kits. Keeping one alive takes pure diesel obsession, but they're still out there. Not many, but enough. And if you're ever lucky, or unlucky enough to drive one, you'll learn quickly. It doesn't forgive, it doesn't coast, it doesn't hum like a modern Euro 6, it fights. Every gear shift feels like you're negotiating peace with the gearbox. Every hill climb sounds like the engine is screaming at God. But when it moves, when it actually hauls, you kinda get it. You feel what Foden wanted this engine to be. Foden's 2-stroke might have been a disaster in the commercial world, but it became a folk legend in the lorry scene, not for what it accomplished, but for how boldly it failed. In a sea of safe decisions, Foden swung for the fences, and even if they struck out, that scream still echoes through truck shows, farmyards, and the hearts of every driver who dared to shift gears in a fire-breathing, oil-leaking, smoke-chucking underdog.